early December 1941. The German advance on Moscow fails in the face of stubborn Soviet resistance and one of the worst Russian winters in living memory. The exhausted German army was unprepared for the bitter cold, which struck men, beasts, and machines alike. Soldiers froze to death or were crippled by frostbite, while their draft horses perished by the thousands. Lubricants and fuel froze, firing pins broke, vehicles refused to start, machine guns stopped firing, and planes grounded. At dawn on December 5th, a fierce Soviet offensive drove the Wehrmacht back and away from Moscow. One of the units in the vicinity of the Soviet capital was the Das Reich Division, which was ordered to withdraw on December 9th. Only 5 days earlier, one of its companies had reached the end of the Moscow tram system. It was a difficult order to accept. Positioned northwest of Moscow, the elite German unit began to retreat westward while wreaking havoc on the attacking Soviet forces. By December 16th, Das Reich was ordered to establish positions at Kshatsk, located nearly 100 kilometers from Moscow. The German defensive line on the Eastern Front was on the verge of crumbling during these days, and in the face of initial success, Stalin demanded his generals to continue attacking. The brunt of the Soviet attack fell on Army Group Center, which was in serious danger of being encircled and annihilated at Rzhev. General Ivan Konev's Kalinin Front, which represented the northern arm of the Great Soviet Pincer, smashed its way through the German lines west of Rzhev. The maneuver separated the German 23rd and 6th Army Corps from the rest of the 9th Army and threatened the Rzhev-Vyazma railway line. The 9th Army was thus left in ruins and facing destruction. It was at this point, in an attempt to save the situation, that General Walter Model came to the rescue. At the headquarters of the 9th Army, Model was asked the following question: "What reserves have you brought us?" Model replied, "Myself." The German general's first measure was to restore his troops' morale and optimism. Model spent about an hour each day studying his maps and 10 hours visiting his troops. Almost miraculously, he managed to close the gap between the 23rd and 6th Corps and secure the Rzhev-Vyazma railway line. Closing the gap was one thing, however, but holding it was quite another. By the end of January 1942, 9 rifle divisions and 4 cavalry divisions belonging to the Soviet 29th and 39th Armies found themselves isolated behind German lines. All they could do was continue to press towards their objective at Vyazma, hoping to join the Soviet pincer struggling to break through to the north. To stop them, the 46th Panzer Corps, with the bulk of Das Reich, the 5th Panzer Division, the 1st Panzer Division, and the 86th Infantry Division, counterattacked to envelop the 2 Soviet armies and completely isolate them near Vyazma. Meanwhile, west of Rzhev, the 30th Army would attempt to drive a new wedge between the 23rd and 6th Corps of the 9th Army and re-establish contact with the 29th Army. Hitler insisted that an SS regiment take over the Soviet relief attacks. In reality, there was only one available, the Der Führer division of Das Reich, which was not in combat at the time. The regiment was placed under the command of the 256th Infantry Division, part of the 6th Corps, and deployed in the same position where the Soviets had previously breached the German lines. Model had full confidence in the men of the Der Führer Regiment and their leader, Colonel Otto Kumm. He had to, for the success or failure of the winter battle for Rzhev ultimately depended on them. However, from an original strength of around 3,000 men by the end of January, the unit had only 650. Equipped with 37 mm anti-tank guns, would they be able to hold back the Soviet armored onslaught? Resist at all costs. At all costs. This was Model's order to Otto Kumm and his men. "We will do so, my general," replied Otto Kumm. Quickly, the men of the Der Führer Regiment headed north of the town of Noshkino and established defensive positions. By January 25th, the 1st Battalion had taken up positions near Solomino, and the 3rd Battalion did so on the other bank of the Volga River. The regiment's headquarters were set up a little further south. In total, the front line was about 12 kilometers long. On their left flank was the 206th Infantry Division of the 23rd Army Corps, and on their right flank was the 161st Infantry Division of the 6th Corps. The Soviets were well entrenched on a wooded hilltop to the north. German attempts to dislodge them and gain more ground were repulsed in a fierce counterattack that claimed many German lives. However, German artillery and machine gun fire stopped the pursuing Soviets in their tracks, and the front line was fixed. Model made sure to stay in personal contact with Otto Kumm. When his vehicle could not get through the snow, he resorted to flying and even arrived at horseback on one occasion. On the 27th of January, Model was informed of a violent attack the Soviets had launched against the 1st SS Battalion with a ratio of forces of more than 3 to 1. At 0200 hours on the 28th, in heavy snow, elements of the Soviet 30th Army attacked Klepenino and Opyachtino and did not stop until nightfall. By then, the enemy had been repulsed everywhere. However, a captured Soviet radio operator confirmed that 7 rifle divisions and 6 tank brigades of the 30th Army were ready to begin their attack the following morning. Their intention was to re-establish contact with the 29th Army at any cost. In response to this information, Model called Otto Kumm back and warned him of what was coming, telling him that he was counting on him to hold back the enemy onslaught. The next morning, the Soviet 30th Army launched its offensive. For 3 long days and nights, regiment after regiment attacked the position of the men of Das Reich without managing to break through the front line. Otto Kumm described what took place on his front line during those days in these words: "The heroism of the men in those days far exceeds anything achieved so far. Each attack is defeated at the cost of terrible casualties, often in hand-to-hand combat with grenades and hand weapons. Heaps of enemy dead pile up in front of the company positions. Most horrible of all are the attacks by enemy tanks." By January 29th, Soviet armor attacked in large numbers in the vicinity of Klepenino and forced the men of the 3rd Battalion to retreat. The next day, a tank destroyer unit arrived to try to support the weak Das Reich regiment's front and was able to stabilize the situation. Despite snowstorms and temperatures that dropped to -46 degrees, the SS troops held their lines against an equally determined enemy. Possession of a village could make the difference between life and death. Another feature of winter combat was that deep snow reduced the effectiveness of artillery. Snow dampened and reduced shrapnel spray and could nearly nullify grenades and mortar shells. Mines could fail to detonate when vehicles drive over them. Although by January 30th, the men of Das Reich had managed to destroy 7 Soviet tanks between Klepenino and Kokosh, they were unable to stop the enemy advance to the south. Both towns were eventually lost during the last hours of the day. At this point, most of the companies of the 3rd Battalion consisted of only 20 or 30 men. Slowly, Soviet units began to penetrate the town of Timanzewo and the Kulisenwald forest. By this time, Das Reich had no tank destroyers left, and its crews were sent into combat to fight as infantry. On January 31st at 11 a.m., reinforcements from the German 256th Infantry Division were able to arrive, and the Soviet advance south of Klepenino and Opyachtino was halted. East of Klepenino, a renewed Soviet assault during the day on January 31st broke through the German defense and broke through to the Kulisenwald forest. A hurricane of Soviet artillery fire wreaked such havoc on German radio communications that information about the Soviet breakthrough did not reach the headquarters of the Der Führer Regiment. The situation became so desperate that Das Reich sent 200 men from its own artillery regiment into battle as infantry. After 2 more days of intense fighting, by February 3rd, the German defense at Opyachtino finally cracked, crushed by up to 40 Soviet T-34s. Hours later, a mortally wounded man staggered into the headquarters of the 3rd Battalion of the Der Führer Regiment. His last words before dying were, "Captain, I am the last of the company. Everyone else is dead." With a nearly 2-kilometer hole in his front line, Otto Kumm called for reinforcements from the headquarters of the 6th Army Corps, but all that was immediately available was a makeshift company of 120 drivers, cooks, and tailors. Having no other option, Kumm reluctantly deployed the new reinforcements to the former positions of the 3rd Battalion's 10th Company. Unsurprisingly, the unit completely fell apart as soon as the Soviets attacked it. On the other hand, the German defenses south of Klepenino continued to hold. However, to the east of the village, the Soviets continued to advance strongly into the Kulisenwald forest. German construction and pioneer troops who were trying to prepare a new defensive line were surprised and destroyed. By the morning of February 4th, Soviet units had crossed the forest and were only 50 meters from the headquarters of the Der Führer Regiment. All the remaining men, including adjutants, officers, radio operators, and drivers, worked like demons to prepare the village's 8 buildings for defense. They dug holes in the ground and pierced the lower beams of the walls. For 3 days, the Soviets attacked relentlessly, their tank fire turning houses into rubble. Captain Holzer was everywhere, inspiring the men to resist, and they did. Gradually, the Soviets redirected their attack eastwards and began to take the towns of Petelino and Timonzewo. By February 2nd and 3, Soviet pressure on the flanks of the remnants of the German SS regiment had forced the Germans to abandon the northern bank of the Volga and retreat south. The Red Army then continued to press toward the town of Kirchdorf, which they were finally able to capture after crossing the Volga River. Fortunately for the Germans, numerous reinforcements from the 256th Infantry Division arrived in the vicinity of Noshkino under the brilliant leadership of Commander Mummert. By February 5th, Mummert's men had driven the Soviets out of Kirchdorf. February 6th was not a good day for the men of the 1st Battalion of the Der Führer Regiment. After clearing the mines and snow, the Soviets attacked the Germans in force. That day, all the men of the battalion's 2nd and 10th companies were wiped out. Nevertheless, the Germans managed to hold out. By the end of the 6th, the entire Der Führer Regiment had only a total of 226 men left. There were fewer than 20 anti-tank guns left, and only 3 of them were 50 mm packs. Facing the SS regiment were elements of the 363rd, 359th, 371st, and 375th Soviet Rifle Divisions and the 2nd and 5th Tank Brigades. On the other hand, between Klepenino and Timonzewo, a gigantic gap had opened in the front line of the depleted 3rd SS Battalion, which threatened to outflank Noshkino and drive a wedge between the 2 battalions. The next day, at 4:30, Soviet infantry supported by numerous T-34S assaulted Solomino, which was defended by the remnants of the 1st SS Battalion. Despite their superiority, they were stopped after losing 5 tanks. It was not until that afternoon that they were finally able to take the village, and the Germans retreated south to Lebsino. On February 8th and 9, a new Soviet offensive was stopped short at Lebsino, at the cost of many German casualties. Only 21 men from the 1st SS Battalion remained there, along with 25 engineers who had been sent as reinforcements. Fighting continued along the entire line of the Führer Regiment during the following days, and Otto Kumm himself had to personally lead many of the actions that resulted in the destruction of 24 enemy tanks. These actions earned him the Knight's Cross. After many gray days, Otto Kumm finally received good news. His men were to be reinforced by the 1st Battalion of the Deutschland Regiment, which also belonged to Das Reich. Thus, a total of 590 elite soldiers were on their way. By the 9th of February, soldiers of the Deutschland Regiment began to arrive at their new positions to the right of the 1st Battalion of the Der Führer Regiment in Petelino. Meanwhile, Lebsino remained one of the hot spots. On February 11th, the Germans were driven out of the town after many attacks and counterattacks from both sides. At Timonzewo, Soviet attacks continued to be held off by the 1st Battalion of the Deutschland Regiment. As night fell on the 11th of February, amid continuing blizzards, elements of the Soviet 371st and 171st Rifle Divisions, supported by 40 tanks, broke through the defenses of the completely depleted 256th Infantry Division at Noshkino. On February 14th, 20 Soviet bombers bombed the front from Petelino to Lebsino. The German Stugs again proved their worth by nullifying a T-34 breakthrough at Lebsino. However, the next day, 8 T-34S and 2 rifle battalions broke through to the village and threatened to advance further south. Later, the Soviets achieved further successes to the southeast, making gains in the areas of Noshkino and Kirchdorf and advancing further west towards Eichwald. Their efforts were increasing at a feverish pace because the internal battle raging in the Rzhev salient was desperate, and the encircled Soviet armies were on the verge of being annihilated. At the same time, Model stepped up the 9th Army's efforts to end the battle. At dawn on February 16th, Stuka dive bombers thundered into the Soviet positions at Lebsino. Unfortunately for the Germans, the 2 remaining Stugs that were to support the subsequent attack on Lebsino became stuck in the snow and could not be withdrawn until the afternoon. The next day, those same Stugs were back in action and joined the fighting again. Stuka bombardment destroyed the Soviet defenses, and by 17.10 hours, Lebsino was back in German hands, but not for long. Another Soviet counterattack with 7 tanks and 200 men drove the 60 Germans out of the village, which by then had become a mass grave for many German and Soviet soldiers. Finally, in a last-minute effort to save their doomed comrades, 6 Soviet tanks broke through Das Reich's lines. SS Grenadiers dealt with the Soviet infantry following in the wake of the tanks, but nothing could stop the tanks. They continued to advance into the rear of the 1st Panzer Division, which was busy clearing out the cauldron. Late in the evening of February 17th, Otto Kumm received an encouraging message from the head of the Das Reich Division. The enemy in the inner cauldron of Rzhev is destroyed. The Der Führer Regiment will be withdrawn from the front line the next day. Orders were then given for the 251st Infantry Division to take over the entire Das Reich section. Das Reich formations were assembled west of Rzhev and moved into Army Reserve. After February 17th, almost as if by magic, the Soviet attacks stopped. It was clear that the battle was over. The Soviet 30th Army tried its best to free its comrades, but was prevented from doing so by the men of Das Reich. It was time for both sides to lick their wounds, and those wounds ran deep. Caught in the cauldron, the Soviet 29th Army was virtually annihilated. The shattered Soviet 39th Army and 11th Cavalry Corps barely escaped the same fate. 10 Soviet divisions were shattered, as well as 5 tank brigades. On the Soviet side, 27,000 men had been killed and 5,000 taken into captivity, along with nearly 200 tanks destroyed. Regarding the losses of the 30th Army trying to save its comrades, Otto Kumm said the following: "During these weeks, the enemy has suffered 15,000 deaths in front of the regiment section. Thanks to the exact knowledge of the numbers of the Soviet regiments and the repeated interrogations of prisoners, it was possible to determine the losses of the Russian battalions and regiments. At the same time, 70 enemy tanks were knocked out in the regiment section, not counting the tanks that broke through and were destroyed by other German elements." A few days later, as the men of Das Reich were preparing to be sent to the rear, Model visited Otto Kumm's headquarters. The German general turned to Otto Kumm and said, "I know what your regiment went through, Kumm, but I still can't spare it. How strong is it now?" Kumm pointed to the window. "Mr. Colonel General, my regiment is lined up outside, ready to go into battle." Model looked out. Only 35 men remained. Despite the heavy losses suffered, Model had reversed 2 months of defeats, saved the 9th Army, and together with the German successes south of Wismar, saved Army Group Center. In this last area, however, it was not until spring that the Soviet armies that had penetrated the German defenses were finally crushed. The bloody setback of the Soviet winter offensive of 1941 and 1942 against Army Group Center reflected that the Soviet command had underestimated the Germans. General Zhukov commented on this series of battles. We overestimated our own driving force and underestimated that of the enemy, who turned out to be a much tougher nut to crack than we had supposed. Zhukov had wisely advised from the beginning that the Red Army did not have the resources to achieve victory everywhere, but an overeager Stalin had not listened to him. However, the great German defensive victories could not hide the fact that the Wehrmacht had failed to capture Moscow. The war would continue, and for the soldiers of the SS Division Das Reich, their comrades in the Wehrmacht, and their Soviet enemies, there would be no respite for years to come. So, what did you think of this regiment's fighting against practically an entire army?